There we go. And we're live. Take it away.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Nate, for having me. I've been looking forward to the opportunity to present in this format. I've been a fan of the sort of pub science model for many years, and this is my first time actually getting a chance to present in this format. I'm just really excited for the opportunity. I understand that with Cafe Sci, kind of the general idea is to have researchers in the Twin Ports community present, from the vast depths of their knowledge and research expertise, and, serve as experts for the local area. And so hopefully you won't be disappointed to know that this presentation is actually based much more in my passion projects than in the research that I actually do at the medical school or that I've done my dissertation research on. A couple of years ago, I just became increasingly aware of the existential threat of climate change and started to better understand the connections between climate change and health. And so I've been actually working to transition, in a sense, to being able to incorporate this more in the academic research work that I actually do. But this presentation is kind of more of a primer to help us all become more aware of the fact that climate change is very much a health issue. And I've tried to keep this presentation a little bit more locally focused on what's happening here in Minnesota along those lines. And also talk about ways that we can actually start to think about addressing climate change, ways that we are actually already addressing climate change in Minnesota, and how those also translate into health benefits. And so I thought for the fun of the Cafe Sci format, I tried to give this a catchy name of climate change and health from A to Z, but instead you're getting climate change and health from air quality to zero emissions vehicles. And hopefully I'll get a chance to kind of cover those topics, maybe not necessarily every letter in between, however. So moving forward, if I can find the right button, there we go. So back in 2009, there was a commission that was put forward from the Lancet, one of kind of the most premier medical journals in the world. They're a British journal, and a University College of London. They spent a year with this commission of experts studying the health impacts of climate change, and they came up with this report released there in May 2009 that kind of had this very dire summary statement that climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. And there's a number of reasons and ways that climate change does, in fact, directly impact health. This is, I think, a really great figure, even though it kind of might seem a little bit busy and hard to sort of get through at first glance. But this actually comes from the CDC. And what I like about it is you kind of have these rings that explain, starting with what we know as the actual sort of environmental impacts, the actual process of climate change, and then moving them out in steps to, we get to sort of these ultimate human health impacts. So I think it bears, again, I realized from our audience that we have a few folks who are scientists and experts, and I was kind of trying to fit some of this to lay people or, various levels of knowledge and expertise in this. So I hope you'll bear with me as we kind of walk through this figure a little bit real quick. But so the center ring of this figure is, like I said, kind of talking about what are those direct sort of atmospheric and large global scale actual impacts and processes of climate change. I'm sure everyone here is very familiar with the fact that it has to do with the increased carbon emissions in the atmosphere. Those increased carbon dioxide levels directly lead to increased temperatures, hence the global warming that is often conflated with climate change or interchangeably used as a term with climate change. And so those rising temperatures are having these impacts that are kind of disrupting our global climate and weather patterns and things like that. So we're seeing more extreme weather, and also that sort of increasing temperature expands, basically increasing the temperature of the ocean, makes it expand and causes sea level rise. So those are sort of those main ecological impacts of climate change. And then the next ring out is how that starts translating into these like more proximal impacts that also lead to health impacts. So for example, we see that, severe weather leads to injuries, fatalities, and mental health impacts. Air pollution is leading to asthma, cardiovascular disease, and other impacts. Changes in, weather, precipitation, and temperatures are leading to changes in vector ecology, which is increasing the dispersal and incidence of vector-borne diseases, infectious diseases. So I think kind of walking through the figure a little bit like that helps to make it all make sense and tie these things together. But I also have some slides to go into each one of these aspects a little bit more deeper. So let's talk first about extreme heat. These great graphics actually come from the American Public Health Association. They've put together some really great explainers as well for climate change and health and how those interconnections happen. But so extreme heat, so the increasing temperatures are also leading to increased incidence of really extreme heat events. And for those who, have been through some extreme heat spells, and certainly those who have a medical background, we know that, heat can be very dangerous for health. It can cause illness from heat stroke, dehydration, things like that. And of course, also these increased temperatures can have an impact on sort of changing the seasonality for allergens and things like that as well. Extreme heat actually does lead directly to deaths from heat stroke and illness. And there's sort of a differential in vulnerability from extreme heat effects. So people who already have chronic health conditions, especially cardiovascular and respiratory conditions, are more vulnerable to extreme heat events, as well as, of course, folks who are living in conditions where they have no respite from extreme heat. So here in Minnesota, especially up here in the northern part of the state, a lot of folks, we don't have air conditioning because why? We're more concerned about winter weather and heat. And so not having any way to actually cool yourself from the temperatures, especially in days where the temperatures don't decrease at night, instead stay hot. And so there's no cycling or resetting. That definitely increases vulnerability. So folks who are in marginalized and impoverished communities. Also pregnant women are of increased vulnerability, and children. And if we move forward and just kind of talk a little bit about how temperatures are changing here in Minnesota. This is an interesting graph that comes from, data comes from NOAA, and some of these slides were coming directly from the Minnesota Department of Health Climate Change and Health Program. They've done a really great job of putting together resources for informing people about these intersections between climate change and health. And so here, what this slide is indicating is we've got on the left a graph that goes all the way from 1859 to 1895 to 1959. And we see that there's been about a 0.2 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature per decade over that period. But in the last just about 65 years, from 1960 to 2016, that trend of increased temperature has definitely increased to about 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. And notably, there's also this clear increased incidence in the really extreme temperatures. So I guess this is showing that in this past period of time, and the data is only up until 2016, that was available for when they prepared this figure, but there's been 9 years that had, extreme temperature highs just in these last, 50 years compared to that, entire almost century before. There's only one of these really extreme heat high temperatures. So again, I guess this is maybe just reiterating something that I already went through, but extreme heat has these particular impacts on cardiovascular and respiratory health, exacerbating chronic conditions. It's also can impact folks who already have existing respiratory conditions like COPD and asthma. And here are the more higher at-risk demographics. So folks who may have impairments in their ability to regulate their own temperature, and folks with limited access to cooled environments. And so what's interesting as well is if we look at some of the data here in Minnesota, kind of the demographic that at least has had the most impact from these extreme heat events is actually young men, ages 15 to 35 years old. And this has more to do with sort of that occupational impact, having increased exposure to extreme heat through folks who work in outdoor environments, folks who exercise or play sports. Also, there might be sort of a, behavioral, psychological aspect to this, and that folks who are in that demographic may be less likely to really recognize the impact that the heat might be having on them, or there's a lot of that sort of culture, especially in sports, athletics. I'm sure people have kind of heard of these reports of like folks in high school sports who end up having heat stroke events because they were encouraged to just keep training and playing and got dehydrated and it wasn't recognized. And that anyway, that causes this increased incidence of emergency department visits in that demographic, at least here in Minnesota. And so this is another important aspect of looking at differential vulnerability to extreme heat. The urban heat island effect. I think that probably in the Twin Ports area, related to being so close to a Great Lake, this might not be as much of an issue because there are geographical features that help to actually cool surface temperatures, or surface temperatures can be cooler or differ from the actual air temperatures. So some of these aspects, like having more green spaces or water, that type of exposure keeps the surface from heating quite so much and can help for this cycling effect to happen so that temperatures can cool during the night. But in areas where there's just a lot of built environment, so asphalt, building construction, things like that, nothing that actually serves as a heat sink in a sense, that area can just become basically an oven, keep incubating and radiating more heat, and there's no opportunity for those shifts of air temperature to really occur. So that's something that I think is probably more impactful maybe in the Twin Cities metro area than in Duluth, but it is something to consider, and that there might be pockets of the city that could experience different heat extremes than other areas. And also there is some evidence that Lake Superior is warming at an alarming rate. So if that trend continues, because the water actually retains heat for a longer period than air temperatures, that could have kind of significant impacts on heat effects as well. Although generally the temperature of the water is cooler than the air temperature. I believe there may be some folks here who better understand the trends in temperature cycling in the lake and can correct me. So yeah, let's talk then about kind of this next major impact of climate change that intersects with health, and that's air pollution, which is a major cause of mortality. And so air pollution is kind of, both in a sense an impact of climate, these impacts sort of intersect in that manner. So directly, the combustion of fossil fuel causes air pollution. So it causes those carbon dioxide emissions that are leading to the warming, the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But it also results in very specific air pollutants that are directly harmful to health. So the World Health Organization has estimated that there are 7 million deaths annually that can directly be tied to exposure to air pollution. And they note that's more than all of the deaths from tuberculosis, malaria, and AIDS combined. And in addition to just this direct air pollutants that are associated with combustion of fossil fuels, climate change does kind of directly increase some other air pollutants. So the increased humidity and flooding from extreme weather events can cause indoor mold growth, which is also a respiratory pathogen. And air pollution can also cause, the increased temperatures can lead to increased allergens. And that, can lead to exacerbations in asthma and allergies, as well as just the different types of air pollutants can directly trigger asthma and other respiratory impacts as well. So when we're talking about those air pollutants that are attributed to the combustion of fossil fuels, particulate matter is one of the major ones. This is kind of a nice graphic that explains what the different classes of particulate matter are, and that they are small enough that they are actually inhaled into the lungs. So this particulate matter 2.5, or fine particulate matter, is kind of the one that usually is more attributed to health harms and directly related to combustion of fossil fuels. But there's also particulate matter 10, PM10, that is very much a component of dust, pollen, molds, things like that. And so, as aforementioned, that also is related to climate change. And so in addition to just the combustion of fossil fuels, like any type of combustion of a fuel source can also result in the release of particulate matter. So the increased incidence of wildfires, that is another impact of climate change, is also something that increases the amount of particulate matter in the air. So for example, this fire in 2011 in the Boundary Waters that burned nearly 145 square miles, spread particulate matter in the form of smoke and ash into Wisconsin and Michigan. And I think that we've also had recent air quality impacts from other smoke plumes that were, coming from Canada, coming from California, things like that. So this is a very serious and real threat. And even though kind of the wildfires out in the West have been getting all of the media attention, because this particulate matter travels in the atmosphere through different types of circulation, it can end up impacting our health here in Minnesota and the Midwest as well. So another major air pollutant that's related to climate change is ground level ozone. And so this is also directly kind of related to this increased intensity of atmospheric UV, and temperatures also increase and exacerbate the formation of ozone, or ground level ozone. So other pollutants that also can be released by combustion of fossil fuels, so nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds. And volatile organic compounds are also released from industrial combustion and of various matters. But so all of those pollutants can react with UV light to create ozone that actually stays here on this side of the atmosphere instead of in the ozone layer where we want it to try to protect us from UV. And that can have harmful impacts on health if it is breathed in. And so in addition to that World Health Organization stat, that was sort of the number of global deaths due to air pollution. Here in Minnesota, the Department of Health and the Pollution Control Agency put out a report in 2015 that was kind of analyzing previous data. And so their most recent year of being able to evidence-based conclusion about air pollution and deaths was from 2008, but they did find reason to believe that air pollution contributed to nearly 2,000 deaths, 400 hospitalizations, and 600 emergency department visits in the Twin Cities that year. Again, when we're thinking about health impacts, it's important to think about those who are, have the greatest vulnerability. And once again, folks who kind of don't have the opportunity to take shelter from these impacts, so folks who work outdoors are going to be exposed to the most air pollution. Folks who are most around transportation pollution, so truck drivers, again, folks who have different respiratory health outcomes, so young children, the elderly, people with underlying respiratory health impacts. And again, anybody who is living in an area where they're just exposed to a lot of pollution from transportation, so living around freeways, highways, et cetera. Here in Minnesota, we kind of have a breakdown of where air quality pollution emissions originate, in a sense. And so interestingly, that transportation sector of just our on-road vehicles, so cars and trucks that we drive, contribute at least 24% of the overall emissions, carbon emissions, and these other harmful pollutants in the state. There's also some contributed by construction and agriculture, those that are contributed by coal-fired power plants and other industrial sources. And then there's sort of these neighborhood sources from heating, wood smoke, incinerators, things like that. And so here's just a little bit more information on that other sort of respiratory health impact, the pollutants that can be related to pollens and other types of allergens. So this increased temperatures has also led to the increased production and potency of pollens, and also a longer season. We've all seen kind of this seasonal shift of maybe it seems like winter is not lasting as long. The temperatures are, getting warmer much more rapidly than in the past, and lingering that way much longer. And so that is contributing to this increased length of the season on which these types of allergenic pollens are produced by plants. And this is kind of an interesting look at projecting, forward due to, plant growth and shifts in the types of trees and plants that produce pollen, and how shifting climatic patterns are going to lead to a shift in their distribution as well. So climate change is going to potentially favor species that just produce more pollen. So currently, in Minnesota, especially in the Twin Ports area and further up the North Shore, there's a lot more conifers and other species of these sort of boreal forest trees, but climate change is going to favor a shift to trees that have more allergenic pollens, like different types of oak or hickory species. And that can also increase the amount of allergens that we're going to be exposed to, directly linked to climate change. So moving to the next of these sort of major links between climate change and health, there are what are considered ecosystem threats, ecosystem shifts that generally results in increasing, conditions that favor the incidence and lifespan of different types of insect vectors that carry infectious illnesses. So these changes in precipitation patterns, humidity, temperature, all of that is leading to an increase or changes in the ranges, lifespans, and perhaps potentially also virulence of vectors and the diseases that they carry. And also extreme weather that can cause, increased rain events or flooding, things like that. That's just creating more pockets of, water that's breeding grounds for a lot of these things, like, of course, our Minnesota state bird, the mosquito, for example. So here's a nice graphic that shows the increase in incidence of Lyme disease in Minnesota over the past, I guess this is only even just from 96 to 2010. I think if we had more recent data, we would see even, greater shifts in distribution and number of cases. And, Lyme disease is another one that, as we're getting more savvy, we'll be better able to identify it, but sometimes maybe the actually, looking for it to diagnose it is not keeping pace with the way that incidence is spreading. Maybe, I don't know, if there's other medical professionals here that are actually practicing clinicians, you can weigh in on that. But I've heard from, doctors in the Duluth area who are, have been at least shocked to have kids coming in who've had tick bites in, months when it wouldn't be expected. So somebody who develops the symptoms of Lyme disease in a time of year when we wouldn't expect ticks around, it might not be the first thing in mind to actually treat someone for Lyme disease, because we're just not expecting that to be happening. So this next major impact, the severe weather that is increasing due to climate change. So we're talking about actual, floods, major storms, these types of natural disasters, and then also changes in precipitation that can lead to droughts on the other hand as well. So these things can cause major disruptions in people's lives. Of course, we've seen like the big hurricanes. We've seen, well, the disruption that happened in Texas recently due to unseasonable, or at least, more severe winter weather than they've experienced before, these types of storms. So that can lead to folks having to be displaced from their homes. And after, and that type of an impact is particularly damaging to mental health as well. Here in Minnesota, this is sort of a projection, or I guess it's based on data, rainfall data, an idea of where areas are expected to either be have more severe impacts from flooding versus severe impacts from droughts related to climate change. So even though there is generally an increase in precipitation and shifts in patterns, it kind of depends on geographically where you are. And so kind of more of the state may be in danger of increased drought moving forward. And I guess around the Twin Ports area, it's going to be more likely to be flooding based on the proximity to these major water resources. Extreme events, aren't necessarily just extreme storms like hurricanes, things like that. Sometimes there's these kind of extreme precipitation events like rain bombs that can be just a huge amount of precipitation in a short period of time that can have major impacts. And so these mega rain events are increasing in frequency, where it used to be something that seemed very anomalous. 7 of the 15 mega 2002. And so all of this, increased flooding, increased rain, these types of things where you can have lots of standing water, it does increase mold growth. And as aforementioned, that is also a respiratory pathogen that can, especially chronic exposure, can lead to some severe respiratory impacts and can also have immune system impacts. And so I had alluded to, when we were talking about extreme storms and displacement, how there can be mental health impacts of climate change as well. And this is an area that certainly needs more attention. I think that anyone who is here tonight who has been paying attention to the increased information about the impacts of climate change probably feels some amount of, or even a sense of grief related to these changes that we're seeing happen around us. And in fact, there was even a term that was coined by an Australian philosopher, solastalgia, that is a sense of grief or distress related to, in a sense, it's been even described as being homesick for your home, even when you're there, because everything has changed so much in that environment that you no longer feel like you are home. So there have certainly been studies that have correlated, thoughts and experiences of climate change with a lot of different mental health impacts. And, folks who have gone through major storm events, severe weather events, often have post-traumatic stress, chronic depression. Anybody living through this period probably is experiencing some level of anxiety and also that level of hopelessness. It's also kind of impacting behaviors and the way that we think about and plan for the future. I know a lot of people are having impacts on family planning and reproductive choices, feeling a sense of, why do we want to bring children into the world when we're thinking about a future that, may not be conducive to them being able to live happy lives. And of course, this leads to all of those types of other diseases of despair, substance abuse, domestic violence, those types of impacts as well. So moving from something that's pretty dire and literally depressing, however, what's interesting is that 6 years after their initial report, the Lancet Commission on Climate Change and Health released this new report in 2015, in which their major summary statement was that tackling climate change could be the greatest global health opportunity of the 21st century. So instead of focusing on the doom and gloom, there's this growing recognition that clearly actually acting on trying to do some mitigation and adaptation in regards to climate change can have some pretty rapid and widespread positive health impacts. So for example, reducing carbon emissions from fossil fuel combustion is obviously a win for health. I'd mentioned before that stat from the World Health Organization that fossil fuel emissions, air pollution had caused 7 million deaths per year globally. And a new study that kind of made a lot of buzz just recently, looking at 2018 data, actually increased that number to 8.7 million deaths per year. And the study also went on to say that without fossil fuel emissions, the average life expectancy of the world's population would increase by more than a year, like average across the board. And global economic health costs would fall just by reducing all of those impacts of air pollution that we've already been talking about. And there is evidence that the impacts or the health impacts from reducing exposure to air pollution from fossil fuel combustion can be pretty rapid and dramatic. One study that I always like to talk about because it's very interesting is that if you remember back in 1996, the Olympics were held in Atlanta, Georgia. And to set up all the spaces for competition, they rerouted traffic through kind of the downtown areas of the city where, if you've ever been to Atlanta, the highways there are pretty intense. There's a lot of traffic. There's like 6 lanes on each side across. It gets really crazy and wild. And of course, the folks who live in that area are exposed to a great deal of air pollution, directly from transportation there. But just by rerouting traffic, so it wasn't kind of going through those same neighborhoods, the number of, emergency department visits for asthma-related incidents in children decreased dramatically over that period of time. So there's like a clear and direct and can be even rapid improvement in health just by reducing exposure to, emissions from fossil fuel combustion. So it leads us to this idea of just reducing our use of fossil fuels is going to be having great health benefits in addition to, achieving our climate change mitigation goals. And so another interesting thing to consider is the impact of COVID-19 on carbon emissions. So already data is coming in that's showing that, the CO2 emissions were at least 17% lower in April 2020 than in April 2019. And estimates are saying that, across the globe, it may have fallen by 8% in 2020 compared to previous years. And of course, it's been kind of extreme in that we've been all locked down due to COVID, but we've kind of moved into this area where we've realized, just how many ways we could be reducing our overall use of vehicle transportation. Working from home, doing these types of remote meetings as much as we want to be together, maybe some kind of hybrid model is very feasible, and it could have some very major benefits moving forward if we employ some of these strategies further down the road to decrease our reliance on vehicle transportation and thus reduce carbon emissions. And so another thing that's happening right now in Minnesota has been the clean cars standards that the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has been working on. So they were tasked by the governor with coming up with improved vehicle emission standards for our state that would basically move us toward an increased number of models of electric vehicles that would be on the market and improve the standards for tailpipe emissions from gasoline powered vehicles as well. And I think this graph that I took from their statement of need and reasonableness might be too small to actually really see what the data is showing, but basically it's kind of looking at from, manufacture to end use, fuel combustion, what are the carbon emissions greenhouse gas emissions from gasoline-powered vehicles versus electric vehicles. And it's pretty clear that even if you factor in the battery technology, everything that is used in zero-emission vehicles or electric vehicles, their overall impact and release of carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, is so vastly reduced compared to our typical gasoline-powered cars. So this rulemaking process is well underway. The Pollution Control Agency wrote a draft rule, and we've just been through a period in which the public could comment on that draft rule, and there were like 14,000 comments in favor of us enacting this rule here in Minnesota, and very far fewer that were in opposition. So now the process is in the hands of an administrative law judge who's going to look through all the information that has been provided by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and everyone who submitted comments on the rule, and make a decision as to whether this rule is needed and reasonable. And hopefully, if it's enacted, it could be a big win for our state. The MPCA has estimated that if enacted by 2034, the rule would result in an annual reduction of 530 tons of particulate matter emissions, compared to continuing on business as usual with how a transportation sector is in Minnesota now. So another potential big win for acting on climate that could also impact health is in the agricultural sector. And generally, it's well recognized that reducing red meat consumption can improve health, but also it can directly improve health through decreasing carbon emissions. So it has those co-benefits. So these graphs come from the most recent report from the Lancet Commission on Climate Change and Health that was released just a couple months ago here in well, it was, I guess, the 2020 report, but it was released in 2021. And they are looking again at things from a global standpoint, but based both on production and consumption. Again, these graphs, I apologize if they're too small to really see all of the details, but the take home from it is that yes, cattle industry produces the most greenhouse gas emissions of any agricultural sector. And also they are kind of directly responsible to, well, basically the way that they framed it based on data from the World Health Organization is that excess consumption of red meat can lead to, excess death. And it seems to also have a relationship with, different cultural backgrounds and things like that, because in the US, we haven't really necessarily shifted our excess red meat consumption and kind of have stayed the same from 1990 to 2018. That is, let's see, I don't know if you see my pointer, but the red line is the Americas anyway, and that's sort of the total deaths that are attributable to excess red meat consumption since 1990 to 2018. But other areas of the world where their consumption has increased have also seen an increase in excess deaths during that time period. So of course, the take home is that reducing our consumption of red meat has direct health benefits, but also has great climate benefits as well. And so then we can factor in those added benefits of reducing carbon emissions and reducing the impacts of climate change and how that'll impact health as well. Just as an aside, I'm not like completely anti red meat consumption or anything. I have been a vegetarian since I was 13, which is many more years than I maybe would care to admit in this forum. But I think that there is a time and place for livestock production as well. I think just reducing consumption is a great idea, but there's a lot of kind of co-benefits too for regenerative farming that uses rotational grazing with livestock animals. So I think that I'm not saying everybody stop eating red meat off the bat, just maybe think about reducing consumption for multiple reasons. And so I wanted to at least touch on one final thing that I think is a really important issue here in our state that we should all be aware of and really thinking about. And that is what's currently happening with tar sands oil pipelines. So generally, if we're talking about the benefits for climate and for health, all those co-benefits that we could accrue by reducing our fossil fuel consumption and combustion, then investing in infrastructure that will expand fossil fuel extraction and combustion is really a giant step backward. It's not moving in the direction that we need to be moving. And so I assume that everyone is at least somewhat aware of this issue because it's been in the news quite a bit. But for many years now, the Enbridge company, which is a company that extracts tar sands oil from Alberta, Canada, and ships it over land through pipelines to refineries and to where it can be shipped out to the rest of the world. They've been looking to replace an older line that was built in the 1960s with a new one that would be both larger and able to be operated at a higher pressure, so it would expand their ability to transport and ultimately sell oil and thus extract even more as well from the tar sands fields in Alberta. And this has been a subject of a lot of contention over the past few years from multiple communities who are opposed to this pipeline. The construction of it will destroy habitat across the state. It does cross treaty lands of the Ojibwe tribes who have been not across the board, but very many have been opposed to that because it interferes with their cultural practices and cultural foods as well. It crosses a lot of water bodies that are where wild rice is produced. It crosses, I think, 195 bodies of water in the state, including the headwaters of the Mississippi. And so there's a lot of concern about a rupture in the pipeline that could lead to a spill into any of these waters as well. But a really important aspect of this is just how much more fossil fuel consumption it would enable if this pipeline were constructed and put into operation. So this new line 3 would allow for the transportation of 760,000 barrels of oil per day through northern Minnesota. And so folks who have kind of done some calculations about this have come up with numbers that it would ultimately result in nearly 200 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions per year. And that's way more than the entire state emissions level in 2016. And it's also been sort of likened to as though we were to build 50 new coal-fired power plants. So the carbon emissions that could be produced by the amount of oil that is going to be transported through this pipeline would be equal to the carbon emissions from operating 50 new coal-fired power plants. So it is a step in the wrong direction if we want to think about reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and thus reducing carbon emissions. And as previously mentioned, some other of the major health impacts of this are the impacts on our Indigenous Minnesotans, both through threatening their treaty lands and important cultural foods, but also a lot of this tar sands oil industry has been tied to gender-based violence against Indigenous women and relatives and the ongoing epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives. So all of these are health impacts of concern from this project. And so there are a lot of groups in the state who are working to try to oppose construction so that we don't see this expansion occur. It's kind of in the hands of the Biden administration to revoke some federal permits for the project. So anyway, Nate had mentioned at the top of the presentation that I currently serve as the executive director for this organization, Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate. And so the name pretty much explains exactly what we are, but we educate health professionals across the state about the health impacts of climate change. And then we activate each other to work toward advocating for policy solutions that will address climate change in ways that are to the benefit of the health of all Minnesotans. So hopefully if you are a health professional, you might be interested in learning more and checking us out. And I kind of will just like to leave you with this parting thought here that comes from the Lancet Countdown report. And that's that every child today, or every child born today, will be affected by climate change. And how we respond will determine the world we live in tomorrow and will shape the health of children across the globe. at every stage of their lives. So without further ado, I think I can end the show and screen sharing, and we can go to the fun part of the evening where we can actually have a discussion if anybody has any questions or would like to talk more about climate change solutions. Happy to just engage.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I have a couple questions, but we will certainly turn it out to the other folks here first. So go ahead and type anything in the chat that you'd like, or unmute yourself and ask any questions. Okay. Are you seeing that one, Brenna? The one that came in the chat?
Yeah, I see that. So thanks, Victoria. For those who aren't reading the chat, and also for the benefit of our recording, Victoria has asked, looking at those death casualty numbers from climate change, obviously someone's death certificate may say heat stroke, etc. So how does one reclassify death cause? That's a really good point. And I mean, one that is kind of a perennial issue, right? And trying to actually really understand these kinds of issues from an epidemiological standpoint, right? So I guess I don't know how every individual study, goes about actually trying to look through health data and come up with causes of death. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, how we attribute. But I mean, it's kind of the same thing that we've been going through with COVID, right? Like if a death certificate says, diabetes or something like that, then people might attribute that as the cause of death versus, we know that COVID actually led to it. But things like chronic exposure to air pollution, right? Well, it's exacerbating cardiovascular and respiratory health. Would somebody have cardiovascular health issues otherwise? Probably, maybe, there's genetic factors. Everything with health is multifactorial. I think the issue is that all of this, contributes to maybe earlier mortality than we would see otherwise. That's factored into it. I guess, I'm sorry, Victoria, I think my answer is just it's complicated. And it's something that we need to come up with better ways of doing those estimations, I think, across the board in public health, so we can get a better handle on it. I think that's why there was even that discrepancy, like with that new report release that was attributing even more deaths to fossil fuels than had been stated before from data from other organizations. Oh, look, Dr. Sandy Stover is helping us out with contributing her knowledge to this. She was saying it would be considered a contributory cause to either natural or accidental, depending on immediate cause. So that's from an actual clinician who's also a faculty member at the medical school. So she knows exactly how that death certificate would be written and interpreted. So hopefully that also helps to answer your question, Victoria. I was thinking about it from a researcher. Sandy is thinking about it from the standpoint of an actual physician. Otherwise, looks like so far in the chat, we're just getting a lot of thank yous from folks, which I do appreciate. Oh, another question from Victoria. Looking at the wheel of public health effects caused by climate change, which do you view as the most threatening? Oh boy. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we can separate them out. There's a lot of factors with, to any individual, which one is going to be the biggest threat to them. I mean, obviously trying to survive like a severe weather event is like the most immediately scary and threatening. My background is in reproductive and developmental endocrinology. And so I think a lot about how exposure to things in the environment during early development can really set us up for, a lifetime of adverse health outcomes or, reduced capacity in various ways. So that's another aspect of the air pollution factor that I didn't get to in this presentation, but air pollution exposure, during pregnancy has been linked to like neurodevelopmental impacts as well, in both actually during fetal development and also for young children exposed to air pollution. So really, I guess any type of chronic exposure impact that happens during development or childhood is what I consider to be the most threatening. But again, that comes a lot from my background. Okay, and May is asking if I can talk about my organization and some of our initiatives. So yeah, Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate was started about in 2015 as kind of an idea from some like some doctors and nurses who already had gotten involved in the climate movement, and they recognized that their health lens really brought something valuable to the table when we were discussing climate change, because all too often the issue is very polarized between environment versus economy and kind of stagnates there. But so by moving things into the realm of talking about health, it can help people to think about it in a new way and have a more productive conversation. So that was the original impetus for forming the organization. And we kind of look at our work as having three arms. So education is a really important one. Trying to educate other health professionals to recognize that climate change is a health issue, so that they can then educate other health professionals, but also further educate anybody who's in their sphere of influence. So direct patient education, and also to understand things like when I was kind of rambling on about recognizing Lyme disease, like if health professionals aren't aware of the fact that incidence is increasing because the lifespan of ticks is increasing, if clinicians are aware of that, then they can reduce those adverse health impacts by just being sure to pay attention to it in their patient population. So that's kind of the importance of this education piece. So we also do directly get involved in policy advocacy. And again, we kind of bring that health lens to bear on that. So we serve as, we provide expert testimony for different legislative initiatives that address climate or different regulatory initiatives. So we provided like expert comments on the health impacts of this clean cars rule that I mentioned in my presentation, to just talk about how important reducing vehicle emissions is for health outcomes. So that's our advocacy arm. And our third arm is talking about how the healthcare industry can be a leader in climate solutions as well. So healthcare sector as a whole also is pretty guilty of contributing a lot of carbon emissions and other issues, because it uses a lot of energy. There even are some direct impacts on things that are used in healthcare that are greenhouse gases. And so we try to advocate for health systems to become more sustainable, so to enact environmental sustainability policies within their systems and to kind of lead the way in that sense. So leading by example, by transforming how we provide healthcare. So that's sort of the three arms of the work that we do. I can put our web URL in the chat as well. It's pretty easy. It's just hp4hc.org, Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate .org. And you can find more information, sign up to join us if you're interested. Hopefully that's helpful, helpful primer on what we do.
I'll get in here with a question. So I have two questions, and I know obviously because of the scope of what we're talking about, there's it's fairly broad, and I have two questions that maybe are outside of the scope of what you've run into. But I was really curious about the piece in terms of sort of the greenhouse gas emissions and fossil fuel consumption being reduced so much during COVID. And I don't know if you've come across any studies that have like tried to estimate if like remote work were to continue at its current pace or something like that, what kind of reductions we could potentially see. So I know, just sort of following up from that, I'm curious to see like, okay, cool, we've seen what kind of reductions we get in this sort of work from home environment. And yeah, I don't know. So have you come across anything like that at all?
Not yet, I bet. Well, and I certainly hope that somebody is doing that analysis. I mean, it sure feels like running the numbers takes a little bit longer. Like, so many of these studies, the data is from, earlier in the 2018 is some of the most recent things we have on, climate change and health and things like that. And like, even that new study on the deaths attributable to fossil fuels is 2018. So that, the stats that I did show were, like I said, from that most recent report from the Lancet Countdown. So I'm sure the folks on that commission had gone and tried to, skim whatever they could find where people were starting to look into this. So I don't think there's been a definitive study yet, just some estimates that are starting to come out. But I do take it as a very hopeful thing, like a very hopeful lesson that we've learned from the pandemic. And I mean, on the one hand, yes, it happened because we were forced to isolate, which is not a good thing. And certainly we don't want to have to do that moving forward. But I think, coming up with sort of a hybrid of, how we could think about just ways to limit our use of vehicle transportation moving forward. It makes sense. Basically, it's a proof of concept. It shows we can do it,
Yeah. That's interesting too. And I wonder, maybe just as a quick follow-up, was that completely just related to like transportation, like decreases in fossil fuel consumption for transportation, or was that sort of across the board? Because obviously, like if people are not going into buildings and we're not, necessarily operating them at the same capacity, same lights, same heat and things like that. Yeah, so I don't know, do you remember if that was just for?
You know what, that's a really good point. And I think I need to pull up that Lancet report to give you the definitive answer, because I'm not, it was in when they were talking, it's a section where they were talking about, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and they mentioned that bit. So I would have to go back and check, but I think, I think it was related to transportation, but
Okay.
Yeah,
and we can chat offline about it too, and I'd be happy to take a look at that. Yeah, if you want to send me that article, that seems neat. So awesome.
Thank you. Probably put it in the chat even, because I think I still have it up. Maybe.
Sweet.
Yeah. Here's the link to the 2020 Lancet Countdown report that I looked at. I was looking at it just to kind of get this presentation ready too, to make sure that I had updated information on a couple of things, because it is the most, like, they're kind of one of the definitive sources on climate change and health information. And like I said, this report was released pretty recently. So
cool. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Oh, we had a question from Eileen. Have I met with any politicians and do they listen to the facts? Well, yes, and sometimes it depends on the politician. We actually, so primarily with HPHC, we do work here in Minnesota. Like we like focusing on local initiatives and feel like we can make the most impact there. So we've met with very many of our Minnesota state legislators, and there are a number who are, really forward thinking and leading the way on sound policy to address climate change. And they're very grateful for hearing about, getting that health expertise to contribute to the policies that they're trying to write and push forward. But there are certainly some who even remain climate deniers. So at the beginning of this current legislative session, the House Committee on Climate and Energy, Finance and Policy, I forget the exact title of it, I'm sorry, I always forget the order of the words, but it's the climate, basically it's the House committee, our state House committee that does issues related to climate and energy. And they had us, or they invited us to do a briefing on health impacts of climate change for them this session. And we had a number of different experts from different aspects of the health professional spectrum come and speak to them. And one of these legislators just went right out and asked the question basically of like, well, is climate change even real? And it was because he has read and is a proponent of a book that's been written by like a climate change denier scientist, which are still out there. They've been, this is a whole other aside, but there's very credible and known evidence that the fossil fuel industry has, paid for scientific experts to, speak to support their claims, and has, operated campaigns of deception for a number of years in these ways. But so oftentimes these sorts of things come out where it's like, oh, but this scientist says that this is a normal phenomenon, it's not man-made, etc. And so this particular legislator has this book, and I think he was saying he's ordered 50 copies so he can give them out to people. And he was even offering them to folks from our contingent to, so he could educate us because he knows better that climate change isn't real. So it's kind of a mixed bag, Eileen. I would say we're moving more towards politicians who are very receptive and gracious about learning about these health impacts and who are moved to act on them and are doing what they can. So. Are there any other questions or comments? Just folks who want to chime in with your own experiences?
I've got another one, but I'm giving a proper amount of silence before getting back in. Okay, well, I'll get in there with one more real quick. So one of my other questions had to do with we talked about sort of red meat consumption and things like that. Have you seen anything about some of like the laboratory meats that are coming out now and sort of their environmental impacts? So like, Impossible and Beyond and all these different things. Have you come across any of that information and how much they reduce or, just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's actually something that has been in my mind because obviously the more energy that you use to produce something, then you start to reduce the actual benefits, right? So there does come a point where, like, in the balance, those carbon emissions, created by cows might be balanced by the carbon emissions needed to create the amount of energy needed to grow meat in the lab and all of that. But I don't know if anybody has done that analysis yet. I think that the companies that make those products certainly claim that their products are more sustainable. So I'm not sure what their numbers are and how exactly they're factoring that in. But I think that there's the last couple times I was trying to look into this kind of specifically for what are all the benefits of plant-based diet, kind of thing, is it looked like the numbers still aren't, just overwhelmingly clear, at least to my knowledge. And I guess this is an area where maybe somebody else here has more expertise, or we can go and try to pull up some stats and figure it out. But I mean, if you're talking about plant agriculture that uses a lot of fossil fuel inputs, then of course that's not going to be as overwhelmingly better a choice than meat. And especially if you compare, like I had mentioned, there's some really sustainable ways to raise livestock. I live in Pine County, and I have a number of friends and neighbors who are sustainable livestock producers who use rotational grazing and engage in regenerative agriculture practices. And those types of things can actually help to really support soil health and lead to more like carbon sequestration by soils. And the livestock is actually a really important part of setting up that whole ecosystem for that to actually occur. So if you were comparing, pastured, rotationally grazed livestock with like mass produced, soy, whatever. So like, I think there's just like a lot of variables there. And so it just comes down to, I guess, thinking about things from, their full origin, that sort of cradle to grave standpoint. But the other piece of everything around fossil fuels, in addition to just their combustion as an energy source, is petrochemicals are used in so many plastics and fertilizers and those types of products as well. And that's not often included in these estimates of, what our consumption is and what the impact is. But they're still being extracted, and the industry is still making money and incentivized to keep extracting and selling and trying to get people to continue buying into it as well. So anything that we do to reduce our use of fossil fuels is helpful in the long run. That includes limiting our consumption of plastics and crops that are produced using, fertilizer and fossil fuel intensive agricultural production methods. So.
Yeah, definitely. I'm curious. So another thing we'll follow up with afterwards. Go see if we can find anything.
Let's see if we can, maybe together we can make the definitive analysis, Nate. But like I said, it would be like a spectrum. It would be like probably, I don't know, like we might even find out that rotationally grazed pastured meat is the best thing.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, we're about a quarter after the hour, so let's do one last call for any final questions, and then if folks don't have any, we'll go ahead and call it a wrap for tonight.
I would like to share, if anybody is so moved after hearing my rants about line 3 in Minnesota. I'm sharing a link to just a helpful Google document that was put together by MN350 that lists a bunch of resources for how one could be involved in, just getting involved in the movement in opposition to line 3. So in case that's of interest to anybody, I just wanted to make sure to put it out there. But there are a lot of, petitions circulating and other ways to be involved in calling on the Biden administration to revoke permits for the construction of that project, and an ongoing project to stop all of the other tar sands pipelines as well. I mean, line 3 literally hits close to home because it's in our backyard here in Minnesota, but there's ongoing things with issues with line 5, which crosses the Straits of Mackinac and Michigan and is corroding, and possibly they're looking to do some further construction there that folks in Michigan are trying to shut down. There's the Dakota Access Pipeline is an ongoing battle. The Biden administration, revoked permits for Keystone XL, but it's not a done deal. So basically we have this ongoing movement from, industry to expand fossil fuel infrastructure when we really need to be investing in renewable energy and not investing in what really looks like it's a dying industry. I mean, there's so much more movement towards electric vehicles and that transition. I mean, folks probably saw that GM has been throwing out all kinds of advertisements for how they're creating new electric vehicles and their intention to go all electric by 2050, I think, or is it even 2030? They might be even more ambitious. I've forgotten for some reason, but I mean, it's definitely coming, and investing so much money into building out more infrastructure for tar sands oil right now is just really going to hurt us in the long run. So Victoria has added a great comment too to our conversation about agriculture. Also look into sustainable cattle that is fed seaweed to produce less methane, and cows that are slaughtered younger so they also produce less methane and don't need as many inputs, i.e. food. That's awesome. I hadn't heard about the seaweed as food yet. I had just heard about like the benefits of, pasturing and grazing, but that's a cool idea too. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. Thank you so much, Brenna, for leading the talk tonight and sharing all the information with us. I see Glenn's clapping. I'm going to clap as well, and
Yay.
you can all clap at home. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and we'll share this video afterwards. We'll share the link on our Facebook page and through our next newsletter and things like that. And I'll connect with you, Brenna, and we can get some cool articles to put in there. And we've got the Lancet article in here and so forth. And feel free to follow up with us at Cafe Sci, and we could potentially put you in touch with Brenna if you have more questions. And yeah, happy Thursday night, everybody, and thanks for coming out. So
thanks, everyone. It was a real pleasure to get to spend this Thursday evening with you. Thanks for listening.
Thanks.